The sun hung mercilessly over the town of Copper Creek, its rays beating down on the dusty main street like hammers on an anvil. It was the kind of September day in 1887 that made horses seek shade and men curse the heavens for their cruelty. Yet, despite the heat, near every soul in town had gathered outside the small wooden church, their Sunday finest already damp with sweat. Jake Sullivan stood at the altar, his calloused hands clasped before him, feeling the weight of 100 eyes upon his back. At 28, he cut a figure that many of the town's ladies had admired from afar, tall and lean from years of working cattle, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of prairie grass after rain. His black suit, borrowed from the general store owner, pulled tight across shoulders made broad by roping and breaking horses. The church door creaked open, and a collective intake of breath swept through the congregation. Margaret Whitfield appeared in the doorway like an apparition of purity itself, her white dress a stark contrast to the weathered wood and desert dust that defined Copper Creek. At 19, she was everything the town believed a bride should be, golden-haired, delicate as china, with a reputation as spotless as her wedding gown. Her father, Judge Theodore Whitfield, escorted her down the aisle with the bearing of a man who owned half the county's cattle and most of its respect. The judge's gray mustache twitched with satisfaction as he delivered his daughter to the altar, placing her small hand in Jake's rough palm with the finality of a business transaction sealed. Reverend Josiah Mills, a thin man whose Adam's apple bobbed nervously above his collar, cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice carried through the stifling church, past the women fanning themselves with whatever they could find, past the men shifting uncomfortably in their tight collars, out into the desert where buzzards circled lazily in the thermal currents. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Jake heard the words as if from a great distance, his gaze fixed on Margaret's face. Pretty, yes, but as blank as fresh paper. In all their courtship, orchestrated by her father and his own need for respectability, he had never once seen genuine emotion flicker behind those cornflower blue eyes. She stood there now, the perfect picture of virginal devotion, and he felt nothing but a hollow ache in his chest. The Reverend's voice droned on about duty and honor, about the sacred bonds between man and wife. Jake's mind wandered to his ranch, to the cattle that needed tending, to anywhere but this moment. Sweat trickled down his spine, and not entirely from the heat. Do you, Margaret Elizabeth Whitfield, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? Margaret's I do came soft and practiced, like she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times before her mirror. The crowd murmured its approval. Mrs. Henderson in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. And do you, Jacob Matthew Sullivan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The words hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Jake opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched, taut as fence wire. Margaret's perfect composure cracked slightly, confusion creeping into her features. The Reverend repeated the question, louder this time, as if Jake might simply have not heard. Jake looked at Margaret, really looked at her for perhaps the first time. He saw not a woman, but a porcelain doll, dressed up and presented for his approval. He thought of all the reasons he stood here, the pressure from the town elders, the promise of acceptance into Copper Creek's higher circles, the land her father had hinted might come their way. None of them had anything to do with love. Jake's voice came out rough as sandpaper. He cleared his throat, aware of the shifting and whispers beginning behind him. I can't. The two words fell like dynamite into a mine shaft. Margaret's eyes widened, her bouquet of wildflowers trembling in her hands. Judge Whitfield's face began its transformation from satisfied pink to apoplectic purple. What did you say? The judge's voice cut through the shocked murmurs like a bullwhip. Jake straightened his shoulders, finding strength in his decision even as he knew it would cost him everything. I said I can't. I don't love her. He turned to Margaret. whose face had gone as white as her dress. "I'm sorry, Margaret. You deserve a man who loves you true, not one who's marrying you for all the wrong reasons." The eruption was immediate and volcanic. Women gasped and fanned themselves more vigorously. Men stood from their pews, voices raised in indignation. Margaret's carefully composed face crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks as her mother rushed to embrace her. "You dare!" Judge Whitfield stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You dare humiliate my daughter, my family, before the entire town?" "I'm doing her a kindness," Jake said quietly, though his words were nearly drowned in the chaos. "Better this than a lifetime of lies." "You're a coward," someone shouted from the back. "A yellow-bellied coward." "Shameful, Mrs." Henderson had abandoned her tears for righteous anger. Leading that poor girl on, Jake walked down the aisle, each step feeling like a mile. The townspeople parted before him as if he carried plague, their faces twisted with disgust and disbelief. He heard the words following him like stones thrown at his back. "Coward, faithless, good-for-nothing drifter." As he reached the church door, Reverend Mills's voice rose above the din. "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." But his plea for Christian charity fell on deaf ears. Copper Creek had its scandal, its fallen hero, and they would feast on it for months to come. Jake pushed through the doors into the blazing sunlight. His horse waited at the hitching post, and he swung into the saddle with practiced ease. As he turned the animal toward his ranch, he caught one last glimpse through the church window. Margaret collapsed in her mother's arms, her white dress pooled around her like spilled milk, her father shouting and gesturing wildly at anyone who would listen. "Cowboy spurned the virgin bride," he heard someone say as he rode past. The words would follow him. He knew, would become his identity in this town that had once welcomed him. But as he spurred his horse into a gallop, leaving behind the church and its judgment, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the freedom of a man who had finally chosen truth over comfort, integrity over acceptance. The desert stretched before him, vast and unforgiving, but somehow less harsh than the society he left behind. In the distance, his small ranch house stood solitary against the horizon, a refuge from the storm he had just created. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, what price he would pay for his honesty. He only knew that for the first time in months. He could breathe without the weight of a lie crushing his chest. Behind him, the church bell began to toll, not in celebration but in mourning for what should have been. The sound carried across the desert, mournful and accusing, but Jake didn't look back. Some bridges, once burned, were meant to stay ash. The weeks that followed Jake's departure from the altar transformed him from respected rancher to pariah, where once men tipped their hats and women offered shy smiles. Now they crossed the street to avoid him. The general storekeeper, Samuel Morrison, who had loaned him the wedding suit, barely acknowledged his presence when Jake came for supplies, sliding his purchases across the counter without meeting his eyes. "That'll be $2 more than usual," Morrison muttered one October morning, his pencil scratching against the ledger. Jake didn't argue. He understood the new tax levied upon him, the price of shame in a small town. He paid without comment and loaded his meager supplies onto his horse, feeling the weight of watching eyes from every window. The Cattlemen's Association, which had once welcomed him as a promising young rancher, sent a terse letter informing him his membership had been reconsidered. The banker, Mr. Hartley, suddenly found issues with Jake's loan payments that had never existed before. Even the Mexican workers who helped during branding season stopped coming around, warned off by their employers who didn't want to be associated with the man who had humiliated the Whitfield family. By November, Jake's world had shrunk to his modest ranch house and the 100 head of cattle that didn't care about his reputation. He worked from dawn to dusk, finding solace in the simple rhythm of ranch life, mending fences, checking water holes, treating sick calves. The physical exhaustion helped quiet his mind, though nothing could completely silence the echo of whispered judgments that followed him like his own shadow. One evening, as purple dusk settled over the desert. Jake sat on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, watching the last light fade from the sky. The liquor burned, but didn't warm the cold space inside him. He had chosen truth over comfort. Yes, but the price of that truth was a loneliness sharp as winter wind. The sound of hooves on the hard-packed trail made him look up. He expected no visitors. Hadn't had any since that September day. But there, materializing from the gathering darkness, came a lone rider on a bay mare. As the figure drew closer, Jake recognized her, though recognized wasn't quite the right word for someone the whole town pretended not to see. Clara Marsh, the widow, the fallen woman, the one whose name proper ladies wouldn't speak aloud. She rode with a straight back despite everything, her dark hair pinned up beneath a practical hat, her dress plain brown cotton that had seen better days. At 32, she wore her hard years in the lines around her green eyes, in the determined set of her jaw. She'd come to Copper Creek 5 years ago. Already a widow, they said, though whispers suggested she'd never truly been married at all. She took in washing and mending, living in a small cabin on the wrong side of town, existing on the margins of respectability. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, drawing her horse to a stop near his porch. Her voice carried a slight southern drawl, marking her as not quite belonging even before her reputation condemned her. "Mrs. Marsh." Jake stood, uncertain. No decent woman visited a bachelor's ranch at dusk. Then again, society had already decided neither of them qualified as decent anymore. "What brings you out here?" She dismounted with practiced ease, tying her horse to the post. "Figured you might be needing some help with mending. Noticed your shirt's got tears when you were in town last week." Jake glanced down at his work shirt, indeed sporting several rips he'd been meaning to tend. "I manage fine on my own." "I'm sure you do." She climbed the porch steps, and in the fading light, he could see the weariness she carried like a second skin. "But managing fine and living are two different things. Trust me, I know." The boldness of her arrival should have scandalized him, but Jake found himself gesturing to the other chair. "Can I offer you something? Coffee? I'm afraid I'm not much of a host these days." "Whiskey, if you're sharing." She settled into the chair with a soft sigh, removing her riding gloves. "And you can drop the formalities. Jake, neither of us has much use for society's rules anymore." He poured her a glass, their fingers brushing as he handed it over. It was the first human touch he'd felt in weeks that wasn't transactional, and something in his chest twisted at the simple contact. They sat in silence for a while, sipping whiskey as stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Finally, Clara spoke. "They're saying Margaret Whitfield won't leave her room. Her father's talking about sending her east to stay with relatives until the scandal dies down." "She's better off without me," Jake said, though the words tasted like ash. Clara laughed, a sound with little humor in it. "Maybe so, but that's not how the town sees it. You broke the rules, Jake. Damaged goods. That's what you made her in their eyes. A fate worse than death for a girl like that. And what about you?" The whiskey loosened his tongue. "What rules did you break?" Her eyes glinted in the lamplight he'd just lit. "Survived. Came to town without a man, without family, without the proper letters of introduction. Had the audacity to make my own way instead of begging relations to take me in." She took another sip. "And maybe I let a married man buy me dinner once. When I was desperate enough to consider it, I didn't let it go further, but that didn't matter to the gossips. In their minds, I might as well have." The confession hung between them, stark and honest. Jake found himself appreciating her frankness after months of society's elaborate dance of manners and expectations. "Why did you really come here, Clara?" She turned to face him fully then, and he saw something in her expression he recognized, the bone-deep loneliness of the outcast. "Because you're the only person in 50 miles who might understand what it's like to be the villain in everyone else's story. Because I'm tired of talking to my wash bucket. Because sometimes the only thing worse than being seen as fallen is not being seen at all." Her honesty struck him like a physical blow. Here was someone who didn't deal in prettied-up half-truths or social niceties. Just raw, unvarnished reality. "Stay for dinner," he heard himself say. "I've got stew that's been simmering all day. Nothing fancy, but it's hot." She smiled then. The first genuine smile he'd seen in weeks. "That sounds fine, Jake. Just fine." They ate in his small kitchen, the kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara told him about her life before Copper Creek, a husband who died of fever, leaving her with debts and no family to turn to. Jake spoke of his parents' ranch up north, how he'd come south to make his own way, how the loneliness had driven him to accept Judge Whitfield's orchestrated courtship of Margaret. "I thought if I could just fit in, become what they expected, the emptiness would go away," he admitted, pushing his empty bowl aside. "But it doesn't work like that," Clara said softly. "You can't fill a hole in your soul with other people's approval. I learned that the hard way." When she rose to leave, Jake walked her to her horse. The night had grown cold, stars thick as spilled salt across the black sky. As she prepared to mount, she paused. "I'll come back tomorrow with your mending, if you'd like. The town will talk, of course. Make up wild stories about the cowboy who spurned the virgin bride spending time with the fallen woman." Jake considered this, then found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Let them talk. I'm done living for their approval." She swung into the saddle with that same easy grace. "Good night, Jake Sullivan." "Good night, Clara." He watched her ride away until the darkness swallowed her, then returned to his empty house. But somehow, it didn't feel quite as empty as before. In his bedroom, he caught sight of himself in the small shaving mirror, weathered, tired, but somehow more himself than he'd been in months. Outside, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Jake found himself thinking about Clara's words. "You can't fill a hole in your soul with other people's approval." He'd tried to do exactly that with Margaret, tried to build a life on the foundation of what others expected rather than what he truly wanted. As he prepared for bed in his simple room, so different from the fancy house Judge Whitfield had hinted would be theirs, Jake whispered into the darkness, "The cowboy spurned the virgin bride and shared his dinner with a fallen woman." It wasn't a scandal yet, just a meal between two outcasts. But Jake had a feeling it was the beginning of something. Whether that something would be his salvation or his final damnation remained to be seen. Either way, he was done pretending to be anything other than what he was, a flawed man trying to find his way in a world that demanded perfection he couldn't give. Winter came early to Copper Creek that year, bringing bitter winds that cut through the valley like knives. The drought that had plagued the territory for months finally broke in December with violent storms that turned the dusty streets to rivers of mud and sent flash floods roaring through the arroyos. Jake lost 12 head of cattle in the first storm, found them days later piled against a wash, bloated and stinking in the sun that followed the rain. He worked alone to drag them out and burn the carcasses, his neighbors having long since stopped offering the help that ranch folk typically extended to one another in times of hardship. Clara had kept her word, returning twice a week with his mending and staying for supper. Their friendship, if it could be called that, had become the single point of warmth in his increasingly cold existence. She never asked for payment for her work, and he never offered, understanding that these visits were as much for her benefit as his. One evening in January, as they sat by his fire with the wind howling outside, Clara spoke of her late husband for the first time in detail. "Thomas wasn't a bad man," she said, her fingers working steadily on a torn shirt. "Just weak. When the fever took him, he left me with nothing but debts and empty promises. The creditors took everything, the house, the furniture, even my wedding ring." She held up her bare left hand. "That's when I learned that a woman alone is either prey or predator in most folks' eyes. And I refused to be prey." Jake watched the firelight play across her face, seeing strength in the lines that others called harsh. "Is that how you ended up here?" "I went from town to town, taking whatever work I could find. Copper Creek seemed as good a place as any to stop running." She smiled bitterly. "Though some days I wonder if I ever really stopped." Their conversation was interrupted by the thunder of hooves approaching fast. Jake rose, hand moving instinctively to the rifle by the door. Through the window, he could see 3 riders splashing through the muddy yard, their forms dark against the storm-gray sky. "Stay inside," he told Clara. Stepping onto the porch, the riders reined up hard, sending mud flying. Jake recognized them. Tom Brennan, Will Foster, and Edgar Haynes, all hands from the Whitfield Ranch. They'd been drinking. That much was clear from how they swayed in their saddles. "Well, well," Brennan slurred, rain streaming off his hat brim. "If it ain't the yellow-bellied bridegroom himself. You boys are a long way from home on a night like this," Jake said evenly, though his grip tightened on the rifle. Foster laughed, an ugly sound. "Came to see if the rumors were true. They say you got that Marsh woman warming your bed now. Traded a virgin for a—" "Careful," Jake warned, raising the rifle slightly. "You're on my property, and I'll thank you to watch your tongue." Haynes, the youngest and drunkest of the 3, pointed at the window where Clara's silhouette was visible. "There she is, the fallen woman herself." "Hey, sweetheart, when you're done with this coward, maybe you can—" The crack of Jake's rifle shot cut him off, the bullet whizzing past Haynes's ear close enough to make him yelp. The horses danced nervously in the mud. "Next one won't miss," Jake said quietly. "Now get off my land." Brennan's face twisted with rage. "Judge Whitfield owns half this valley. Sullivan, you can't hide behind that pop gun forever. Maybe not, but I can tonight. Get!" They wheeled their horses around, but Brennan called back over his shoulder. "This ain't over. Sullivan, you dishonored the judge's daughter. There's a reckoning coming." After they'd gone, Jake found Clara standing in the doorway, his Colt .45 in her steady hands. "I would have shot them if they'd tried anything," she said simply. "I know." He was surprised to realize he meant it. This woman who the town called Fallen had more steel in her spine than most men he'd known. The encounter with Whitfield's men marked a turning point. The cold shoulders and whispered insults evolved into open hostility. Jake found fences cut, water holes fouled with dead animals, threatening notes nailed to his door. The sheriff, when Jake reported it, simply shrugged and suggested maybe it was time Jake considered moving on. "Folks have long memories around here," Sheriff Campbell said, not bothering to hide his indifference. "Man who breaks his word at the altar, well, he shouldn't expect much sympathy when trouble finds him." Clara faced her own escalation of torment. The ladies of the town, led by the vindictive Mrs. Henderson, organized a campaign to deny her even the meager living she scraped together. One by one, her washing clients sent word they no longer required her services. The owner of the boarding house where she rented a room gave her notice to vacate by month's end. She arrived at Jake's ranch one February evening with all her worldly possessions in 2 carpet bags and a bruise darkening her left cheek. "What happened?" Jake demanded, helping her down from the wagon she'd hired. "Some of the good ladies of Copper Creek decided I needed a lesson in staying away from decent folks' menfolk." She touched the bruise gingerly. "Mrs. Morrison throws a mean right hand for a shopkeeper's wife." Rage flooded through Jake. "I'll go to town. Demand the sheriff—" "Don't!" Clara caught his arm. "It'll only make things worse. Besides, they made their point clear. No one in town will rent to me or give me work. They want me gone." Jake looked at her standing there in his yard, rain starting to fall again, her few possessions getting wet in the wagon bed. He thought of all the rules they'd already broken, all the bridges already burned. "Stay here," he said. "I've got a spare room. It ain't much, but it's dry and warm." She searched his face. "Jake, if I stay here, even in a spare room, the whole town will believe that I'm your—" "Let them think what they want. They've already made up their minds about both of us anyway." He grabbed her carpet bags. "Besides, I could use the help around here. This ranch is too much for one man, and you're handier than most with a rifle. Room and board in exchange for work. A business arrangement." Clara smiled sadly. A business arrangement between the cowboy who spurned the virgin bride and the fallen woman. What a pair we make. That night, as they set up her few belongings in the spare room, snow began to fall, rare for the territory, even in winter. Jake built up the fire while Clara made coffee, and they sat watching the white curtain descend outside the windows, transforming the harsh landscape into something softer, almost forgiving. "My mother would be horrified," Clara said quietly. "She raised me to be a proper Southern lady, taught me to pour tea and embroider samplers and never be alone with a man who wasn't kin. My folks wanted me to marry a nice girl and give them grandchildren." Jake replied, "Guess we're both disappointments." "Or maybe," Clara said, warming her hands on her coffee cup, "we're just people trying to survive in a world that doesn't have much room for anyone who doesn't fit the mold." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the muddy tracks of Whitfield's men, the cut fences, the fouled waterholes. For a moment, Jake could almost pretend it was covering over all their troubles, giving them a clean slate come morning. But he knew better. Come dawn, the snow would melt under the desert sun, and their problems would remain. The town's judgment, Whitfield's anger, the isolation that pressed in on them from all sides, none of it would disappear with the snow. Still, as he bid Clara good night and watched her close the door to her new room, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not quite hope, he wasn't fool enough for that, but perhaps the absence of despair. He wasn't alone anymore in his exile, and sometimes that had to be enough. In the dying firelight, he whispered to the empty room. The cowboy spurned the virgin bride and gave shelter to the fallen woman. He wondered what his parents would think, what the town would say come morning when they discovered Clara Marsh had moved to his ranch. Then he decided he didn't care. The worst had already happened. They'd already marked him as a pariah. What was one more sin in their ledger of his failings? At least this one came from kindness rather than cowardice, from choosing to help someone rather than hurt them. The snow fell through the night, and for the first time in months, Jake Sullivan slept without dreams. Spring arrived with a violent beauty that year, painting the desert in brilliant swaths of yellow brittlebush and purple lupine. The winter had been hard, but Jake and Clara had survived it together, falling into a rhythm of shared labor that felt as natural as breathing. She proved herself invaluable around the ranch, not just with domestic tasks, but with the cattle, showing a surprising aptitude for reading the weather and spotting sick animals before they showed obvious signs. It was during the spring roundup that trouble found them again. Jake had managed to hire 2 Mexican vaqueros, Miguel and Carlos, who cared more about steady pay than town gossip. They were branding the new calves when riders appeared on the horizon. A dozen men, moving with purpose. "Trouble," Clara said quietly from where she tended the branding fire. She'd taken to wearing men's trousers for ranch work. Another scandal for the town to whisper about, but practical for the life they led. Jake straightened from the calf he'd just released, wiping sweat from his brow. As the riders drew closer, he recognized them. Tom Brennan leading Whitfield hands, accompanied by 3 men he didn't know, hard-looking men with low-slung guns and eyes like chips of flint. "Sullivan," Brennan called out as they reined up just outside the corral. "Judge wants a word. The judge knows where to find me if he wants to talk," Jake replied, keeping his voice level. One of the strangers, a lean man with pockmarked skin and dead eyes, spit tobacco juice into the dust. "Man don't come when Judge Whitfield calls. Maybe the mountain comes to Mohammed, if you take my meaning." Clara moved closer to where the rifles leaned against the fence posts. The stranger's eyes tracked her movement, and the pockmarked man smiled unpleasantly. Well, the fallen woman herself. Heard stories about you, ma'am. All of them interesting. State your business and move on," Jake said, his hand dropping to his sidearm. Brennan leaned forward in his saddle. "Business is simple. Some of Whitfield's prize bulls have gone missing. Funny thing is, tracks lead right toward your spread. You're accusing me of rustling." Jake kept his voice calm despite the anger rising in his chest. "Not accusing," the pockmarked stranger said. "Just observing. Course, could be a misunderstanding." Could be those bulls just wandered off and someone was taking care of them, waiting for the chance to return them. Jake understood the game now. Plant stolen cattle on his land, then discover them, with his reputation in tatters. Who would believe his innocence? "You won't find any Whitfield cattle here," Jake said firmly. "Mind if we look around?" Brennan asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Yes, I mind. This is my property. You want to search it? Come back with the sheriff and a warrant." The strangers exchanged glances, and the tension ratcheted up another notch. Miguel and Carlos had stopped working, hands drifting toward their own weapons. "Now, that's unfriendly," the pockmarked man said. "Almost like you got something to hide. Maybe something more than just cattle. Pretty little setup you got here. Sullivan, man and woman, living in sin. Probably up to all sorts of—" The crack of Clara's rifle shot sent his hat spinning into the dust. The stranger's hand flew to his gun, but Jake already had his Colt drawn. "The lady's a better shot than I am," Jake said conversationally. "Next one takes an ear. After that, well, gets messier." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Brennan raised a hand. "Easy, boys. We're just having a conversation. Conversation's over." Jake said, "Get off my land. Tell Whitfield if he wants to accuse me of something, do it legal. Otherwise, stay away." The pockmarked stranger retrieved his hat, examining the bullet hole with something almost like admiration. "Feisty woman you got there. Sullivan. Be a shame if something happened to her." "That sound like a threat to you? Clara?" Jake asked, without taking his eyes off the riders. "Sure does," she replied, lever-actioning another round. "And I don't take kindly to threats." The riders wheeled their horses around, but Brennan called back. "This ain't over. Sullivan, Judge Whitfield don't forget insults. Neither do we." After they'd gone, Clara lowered the rifle with shaking hands. "They'll be back." "I know." Jake holstered his Colt. "Miguel, Carlos, you boys might want to find work elsewhere. This is about to get ugly." But the vaqueros shook their heads. "We stay, patron," Miguel said simply. "You pay fair. Treat us good. These men," he spit, "we know their type." That night, Jake couldn't settle. He paced the porch while Clara cleaned her rifle at the kitchen table, the methodical movements somehow soothing. "They'll plant those cattle," she said without looking up. "Then come back with the sheriff and a rope. Probably." Jake stopped pacing, looking out at the star-filled sky. "You should leave. Clara, this isn't your fight." She looked up then, green eyes flashing. "Isn't it? They drove me from town same as you. Where would I go? Another town? Another set of proper folks who'll take one look and see only what they want to see?" She shook her head. "No, Jake, for better or worse, this is my stand too." He moved into the kitchen, drawn by the lamplight and her presence. "Why? Why stay and fight for a ranch that isn't yours, alongside a man who isn't—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Clara set down the rifle and stood, moving closer. "Isn't what? Isn't my husband? Isn't my lover? The whole town thinks both anyway." She reached out, touching his face gently. "You want to know what you are? Jake Sullivan? You're the only person in 100 miles who looks at me and sees a person, not a cautionary tale." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Jake found himself leaning closer, drawn by something stronger than propriety or caution. But Clara stepped back, a sad smile on her face. "Don't," she said softly. "Not for the wrong reasons. Not because we're lonely and scared and the whole world's against us." Jake's hands clenched at his sides. "What if those aren't the wrong reasons? What if that's all we get? Then we deserve better." She picked up the rifle again. "Both of us. We deserve something real, not just two people clinging together in a storm." That night, Jake lay in his narrow bed, listening to Clara moving about in her room across the hall. The space between them felt both infinite and paper-thin. He thought about her words, about right reasons and wrong ones, about what they deserved versus what they had. Come morning, they found the first Whitfield bull in their north pasture, its brand fresh and obvious. 2 more appeared over the next days. despite their vigilance. The trap was closing, and they both knew it. "We could run," Clara suggested one evening as they watched the sunset paint the desert in shades of blood and gold. "Pack what we can. Head for California or Oregon. Start fresh where nobody knows our names." Jake considered it, the thought of leaving everything behind. Starting over with Clara somewhere green and distant held undeniable appeal. But then he looked at the ranch, his parents' dream made real through his sweat and sacrifice, and shook his head. "This is my home. I won't let them drive me off it." Clara nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "Then we make our stand. Together. Together," Jake agreed, reaching out to take her hand. She let him, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising another night of violent weather. But for this moment, sitting on the porch of a modest ranch house with a woman the world called fallen, Jake felt more at peace than he had in years. Whatever came next, sheriffs or vigilantes, justice or vengeance, at least he wouldn't face it alone. "The cowboy spurned the virgin bride," Clara said softly, echoing the words that had become Copper Creek's favorite gossip, "and found something real with the fallen woman." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe that's not the tragedy they think it is." "Maybe not," Clara agreed, leaning against his shoulder as the first drops of rain began to fall. "Maybe it's just the beginning." The morning they came for Jake dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that made the desert bloom with false promises. Clara was making breakfast when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, too large to be anything but a posse. "They're coming," she said quietly, and Jake nodded, having expected this since they'd found the planted cattle. Sheriff Campbell rode at the head of 20 men, including Judge Whitfield himself, dressed in his black suit despite the heat. The judge's face showed the months of festering anger since his daughter's humiliation, etched deep in the lines around his mouth. "Jake Sullivan," Campbell called out, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've got a warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle rustling. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." Jake stepped onto the porch, hands visible but near his gun. "Those cattle were planted, Sheriff, and you know it. That's for a jury to decide." Campbell replied, but his eyes wouldn't meet Jake's. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Judge Whitfield pushed his horse forward. "You've dishonored my family, Sullivan, destroyed my daughter's reputation. She left for Boston last month. Did you know that? Too ashamed to show her face in town. 19 years old and already marked as the girl who wasn't good enough for a no-account drifter." "I'm sorry for Margaret's pain," Jake said honestly. "But marrying her would have been a worse cruelty." "You dare speak of cruelty?" Whitfield's voice rose. "You, living in sin with that woman? Flaunting your degradation before the entire town." Clara appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. "I'm right here. Judge, if you've got something to say about me, say it direct." The judge's face purpled. "Shameless. Both of you. Absolutely shameless. Well, it ends today. You'll hang for rustling. Sullivan. And she'll be run out of the territory on a rail. Over my dead body," Clara said flatly. "That can be arranged," someone muttered from the posse. Jake felt the situation balanced on a knife's edge. 20 armed men, the law ostensibly on their side, against him, Clara, and the 2 vaqueros who'd appeared around the corners of the house, rifles ready. Then came the unexpected, the thunder of more hooves. Another group of riders appeared, these coming from the east. As they drew closer, Jake recognized Sam Cooper, who owned the neighboring spread, along with his sons and several hands. "Morning, Sheriff," Cooper called out, reining up between the house and the posse. "Mighty big gathering for one arrest. This is legal business, Sam," Campbell said uneasily. "No concern of yours. See, that's where you're wrong." Cooper shifted in his saddle, his weathered face grave. "Been watching this unfold for months now. Jake Sullivan may have made a fool of himself at that wedding, but he ain't no rustler. Man's been nothing but honest in all his dealings with me." "Planted evidence is still evidence?" Whitfield snapped. The cattle were found on his property. Were they now? Cooper's son, Matthew, spoke up. Funny thing, we saw some riders moving cattle in the night few days back. Looked mighty suspicious, so we followed. Saw them drive those bulls right onto Sullivan's land. You're lying, Brennan snarled from among the posse. Calling me a liar, Tom? Matthew's hand dropped to his gun. Because we'd be happy to swear to what we saw before any honest judge. Course, that might not include you, Your Honor, seeing as how those were your men we saw. The posse stirred uneasily. Many were townsmen, deputized for the occasion, not gunfighters. The prospect of a real fight, especially with the moral ground shifting beneath them, cooled their enthusiasm considerably. Sheriff Campbell looked between the two groups, sweat beading his forehead. Now, everybody calm down. Sam, if you've got testimony about this matter, proper procedure is— His words were cut off by a woman's scream from town. All heads turned to see smoke rising in a black column from Copper Creek's main street. Fire! Someone shouted. The church is on fire! For a moment, nobody moved. Then Clara spoke, her voice cutting through the chaos. Convenient timing. While all the menfolk are out here playing at justice, the town burns. This isn't over, Judge Whitfield snarled at Jake. Cooper's protection won't last forever. But the spell was broken. The posse wheeled their horses around, racing back toward town and the spreading smoke. Only Whitfield lingered, his eyes boring into Jake with undimmed hatred. You've destroyed everything I built, the judge said quietly. My reputation, my daughter's future, the natural order of things. For what? For her? He gestured dismissively at Clara. You'll pay for this. Sullivan, maybe not today, but soon. After he'd gone, Cooper and his men remained. The rancher dismounted, approaching Jake with an outstretched hand. Appreciate the help, Sam, Jake said, shaking it firmly. Though I'm surprised you'd stick your neck out for me after everything. Cooper shrugged. Man's got a right to make his own choices, even bad ones. But framing you for rustling, that ain't justice. That's revenge, and I won't stand for it on my range. He glanced at Clara. Ma'am, she nodded. Mr. Cooper, my wife says to tell you she needs some sewing done. If you're of a mind to take the work, she don't hold with town gossip, and neither do I. Clara's eyes widened, the first hint of tears Jake had seen from her. Thank you. Tell her I'd be grateful for the work. After Cooper and his men left, Jake and Clara stood in the sudden quiet of their yard. The smoke from town had thickened, and they could hear the distant bell clanging alarm. That fire. Clara began. Yeah. Jake knew what she was thinking. Too convenient, too well-timed. Someone wanted to make sure the posse couldn't finish their business here. Who would do that for us? Jake didn't have an answer. They had no friends left in town, or so they'd thought. But perhaps they'd underestimated the number of people who'd grown tired of Judge Whitfield's iron-fisted rule, who'd seen one too many people crushed under his version of justice. That night, news trickled out from town. The church had burned, along with the adjoining courthouse where all the legal documents were stored, including warrants and evidence. Margaret Whitfield, they learned, hadn't gone to Boston after all. She'd been seen at the train station the morning of the fire, boarding eastbound with a carpet bag and no companion. The timing seemed more than coincidental. You think she— Clara asked as they sat by the fire. Set the fire? No, Margaret wouldn't have the nerve. Jake stared into the flames. But she might have known who did. One last gift, maybe, or revenge of her own against her father. Clara moved closer, and this time Jake didn't hesitate to put his arm around her. We can't stay here. Jake, Whitfield won't stop. He'll find another way. I know. Jake had been thinking the same thing. Cooper offered to buy my herd at fair price. With that money, we could head north, maybe Montana, start fresh where the Whitfield name doesn't mean anything. We? Clara looked up at him. You're assuming a lot. Jake Sullivan. Am I? He met her gaze steadily. Because I'm done running from what I want. Clara, I was a coward at that altar, but not for the reason everyone thinks. I was afraid to admit I was looking for something real, something true, and I found it, just not where anyone expected. Clara's hand found his face, rough fingers gentle against his cheek. A cowboy and a fallen woman. What a pair we make. Just two people, Jake corrected. Two people who see each other clear. They left Copper Creek a week later, their possessions loaded in a wagon, Cooper's payment heavy in Jake's saddlebags. As they crested the rise that would take them out of the valley, Clara asked him to stop. They sat there, looking back at the town that had shaped and scarred them both. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the church, and Jake wondered if Margaret had found her own freedom in that act of destruction, wherever she was now. No regrets? Clara asked. Jake thought of all he was leaving, his ranch, his parents' dream, the life he'd thought he wanted. Then he looked at Clara, strong and real beside him, heading into an uncertain future together. None, he said, and meant it. The cowboy spurned the virgin bride and chose the fallen woman. Let them tell that story however they want. We know the truth of it. Clara smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something beautiful. The truth is, we chose each other. The truth is, we chose each other. Jake agreed, and snapped the reins, sending them forward into whatever came next. The Montana Territory greeted them with snow in September, a harsh welcome after the desert heat they'd known. Jake and Clara had traveled for 3 months, following the cattle trails north through Colorado and Wyoming, sleeping under stars and washing in cold streams. The journey had hardened them both, but also stripped away the last pretenses between them. They found land in a valley cupped between purple mountains, where a creek ran clear even in drought years. The previous owner had died the winter before, leaving behind a solid cabin in the framework of what could be a good ranch. Jake paid cash, the deed made out to Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, a fiction that the land agent didn't question and Clara didn't correct. Their first Montana winter tested them like nothing in Copper Creek ever had. Snow piled to the eaves of the cabin, and temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket between the stove and the table. They lost half their small herd to wolves and weather, found the carcasses in spring looking like scattered bones from some ancient burial. We could have stayed south, Clara said one particularly brutal night, as they huddled together under every blanket they owned. Found somewhere warmer to disappear. You regretting it? Jake asked, though he pulled her closer as he spoke. No, she said firmly. Just observing. Besides, the cold has its advantages. Keeps the past frozen, too. They learned to work together in ways that went beyond their arrangement in Copper Creek. Jake taught Clara to read the weather and the movement of clouds over mountains, to spot the signs of a blizzard before it hit. She taught him patience, how to stretch supplies through lean times, how to find small pleasures in a life stripped to its essentials. By their second spring, they'd established themselves enough that neighboring ranchers began to take notice. The Andersons from the next valley over came calling first, bringing a welcome basket and careful questions. Been wondering when we'd get new neighbors, Mrs. Anderson said, eyeing Clara's ringless finger but saying nothing directly. This country's hard enough without folks being strangers. They were invited to a barn raising that summer. Jake hesitant, but Clara insisting they needed to try. We can't live like hermits forever, she said. And these aren't Copper Creek people. They don't know our story. At the barn raising, they worked alongside the other couples, Jake with the men hefting beams, Clara with the women preparing food. She caught some speculative looks, but weathered them with quiet dignity. When someone finally asked directly about their marriage, Clara met their eyes steadily. Jake and I have an understanding, she said simply. That's all that matters to us. The woman, Mrs. Garrett, studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Lord knows this country's too hard to be throwing stones at folks trying to make their way honest. That became their reception in the community. Cautious acceptance rather than enthusiasm. But it was enough. They were that couple from down south who kept to themselves but paid their debts and helped when needed. If anyone suspected their true relationship, the harsh practicality of frontier life kept them from making much fuss about it. The third year brought unexpected prosperity. Cattle prices rose, and their herd, carefully rebuilt, thrived in the mountain pastures. Jake expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom to replace the single room they'd been sharing, though the new room went largely unused, a fiction maintained for the rare visitors. One evening that autumn, as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold, Clara broke a comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about her? Margaret?" Jake considered. "Sometimes. Hope she found whatever she was looking for. And the life you could have had, the respectability, the place in society." Had respectability. Jake said it fit like a borrowed suit, too tight in some places, too loose in others. He took her hand, work rough and strong. "This fits better?" Clara smiled, but there was sadness in it. "We're not really married. Jake, in the eyes of law or God." "In whose eyes, then, does it matter?" Jake interrupted. "We made promises to each other. We kept them. Every day we choose this life. Each other. Isn't that more than most marriages have?" She leaned against him, and they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. But their peace was shattered weeks later when Jake returned from town with supplies and a grim expression. "What is it?" Clara asked, reading trouble in every line of his body. He handed her a letter, addressed to Jake Sullivan and the woman. Inside, in spidery handwriting, was a message that chilled them both. "Found you at last. The judge is dead, but his memory and his hatred live on. His daughter took her own life last Christmas, threw herself from a Boston bridge. Her blood is on your hands. Justice may be delayed, but never denied. We're coming. T. Brennan." Clara's hands shook slightly as she set the letter down. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is they did." Jake moved to the window, scanning the peaceful valley that suddenly felt exposed. "We need to prepare." They turned their cabin into a fortress over the following weeks, laying in ammunition and supplies, creating clear fields of fire. Jake reached out to the neighbors they'd cultivated, not telling them everything but enough, that men from their past might come bringing trouble. Anderson surprised him with his response. "Every man's got history. Sullivan, you've been good neighbors. That counts for something here." But when trouble came, it arrived not as expected. Instead of riders in the night, a well-dressed man appeared one morning in a hired buggy, picking his way carefully up their rough track. Clara recognized him first. "That's Margaret's cousin," she whispered. "Robert Whitfield. He's a lawyer in Denver." Jake met him in the yard, hand near his gun, but Robert Whitfield raised both hands peacefully. "I'm not here for revenge, Mr. Sullivan." Quite the opposite. They listened, wary but curious. As he explained, Judge Whitfield had died of apoplexy the previous year, his empire crumbling without his iron will to hold it together. Margaret had indeed taken her own life, but not from shame over Jake's rejection. "She left a letter," Robert said, producing an envelope. "She wanted you to have it." Jake read it with Clara looking over his shoulder. "Jake, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because of what happened at our wedding, but because of what I learned after. My father was a monster who destroyed lives for sport. You were right to run. I only wish I'd had your courage sooner. The fire was my gift to you, my small revenge against him. Be happy with her. You both deserve it. Margaret." "There's more," Robert continued. "Brennan and his men have been using my uncle's death to justify their vendetta, but they're wanted now for crimes of their own, robbery, murder. They're not coming as lawmen, but as outlaws. I've alerted the territorial marshals." Clara found her voice. "Why help us?" Robert's smile was tired. "Because Margaret asked me to in her letter, and because someone should get a happy ending from all this tragedy." He left them with a warning to stay vigilant and a promise that the law was now on their side. As his buggy disappeared down the track, Jake and Clara stood together in their yard, processing this unexpected turn. "She saved us twice," Clara said quietly. "That poor girl. She saved herself the only way she knew how." Jake replied, folding the letter carefully. "We honor her by living well." That night, as they lay together in the bed they'd shared for 3 years, Clara spoke into the darkness. "I want to make it real. Jake, the marriage. Find a justice of the peace. Make it legal." Jake pulled her closer. "You sure? After everything, you want to be tied to me by law?" "I'm already tied to you by everything that matters," she said. "Love, work, survival, choice. The law's just paper, but maybe it's paper that would honor what we've built, what we are to each other." "Then we'll do it," Jake agreed. "Though I warn you, I don't have a ring. And I might run from this altar too if you try to put me in a borrowed suit." Clara laughed, the sound rich in the darkness. "I'll take you as you are. Jake Sullivan. I always have." A week later, they stood before a justice of the peace in the nearest town, dressed in their everyday clothes. No witnesses but the man's wife and a passing miner recruited for the purpose. There were no flowers, no church bells, no white dress or gathered congregation. Just two people who'd traveled hard roads to find each other, making legal what had long been true in their hearts. "Do you take this woman?" the justice asked. This time, Jake's "I do" came without hesitation, strong and sure as Montana granite. As they signed the certificate, Clara whispered, "The cowboy spurned the virgin bride and married the fallen woman." "No," Jake corrected gently. "A man married a woman. Everything else is just story." But he knew the story would persist, twisted into legend by time and telling. Somewhere, people would still speak of the scandal, the shame, the sin. Let them. He and Clara had written their own ending, and it was better than any fiction the gossips could create. They returned to their ranch as the first snows of another winter began to fall. Two people made one by choice and chance, by hardship and hope. Whatever came next, Brennan's threats or peace, prosperity or struggle, they would face it together. And that was enough. That was everything. They came at dawn on a December morning, when ice crystals hung in the air like suspended stars, and the world lay muffled under fresh snow. Jake woke to the sound that every rancher feared, the sudden silence of cattle that sensed predators. He rolled from bed, grabbing his rifle in one smooth motion. Clara was already awake, reaching for the shotgun they kept loaded by the door. 3 years of vigilance had honed their instincts sharp as winter wind. "How many?" Clara whispered, peering through the frost-etched window. Jake counted shadows moving against the snow. 6, maybe 7, coming from the north ridge. They drilled for this, planned every angle of defense. Clara took position at the east window while Jake covered the front. The barn offered some protection for their horses, but the cattle in the near pasture were exposed. The first shot shattered the morning stillness, followed by the bellow of a wounded steer. The raiders were killing their livestock, a calculated cruelty meant to draw them out. "Brennan!" Jake shouted through the door. "That you out there?" A familiar voice carried across the snow. "Morning, Sullivan. Fine herd you got here. Shame to waste good beef. But you cost me 3 years of my life. Figure I'll take payment in blood. Yours or the cattle's." Another shot, another dying animal. Jake's jaw clenched, but Clara touched his arm. "Don't let him bait you. Help is coming." Anderson had promised to watch for trouble, to ride for the marshal at the first sign, but the nearest law was 2 days away, and Brennan knew it. "Come on out, Sullivan," Brennan called. "Face me like a man instead of hiding behind that woman's skirts. Oh wait, she doesn't wear skirts, does she? Too busy pretending to be something she's not." Clara's face hardened, but her voice stayed calm. "Let them waste ammunition on cattle. We've got supplies to outlast them." But Brennan had learned patience in 3 years of running. His men spread out, taking cover behind the barn, the smokehouse, the woodpile. They settled in for a siege. The morning crawled by in sporadic gunfire. Jake and Clara took turns watching, conserving their strength. When one of Brennan's men tried to rush the house, Jake's rifle drove him back, leaving blood trail in the snow. "That's Haynes," Clara noted with grim satisfaction. "Won't be sitting a horse comfortable for a while." By noon, the situation had shifted. Smoke began rising from the barn. They'd set fire to the hay stores. The horses screamed in terror, and Jake knew they had minutes before the whole structure went up. "Cover me," he said, preparing to run for the barn. "Jake, no! That's what they want!" But he was already moving, sprinting across the open ground. Bullets whined past like angry hornets, churning up snow at his feet. He reached the barn doors, threw them open, and began cutting horses loose. They bolted into the winter day, wild with fear. A figure loomed in the smoke, one of Brennan's men. Gun raised. Jake drew and fired in one motion, the man spinning away, but more were coming, using the smoke as cover. Then Clara was there, having abandoned the house to guard his back. They fought together through the burning barn, saving what stock they could. Her shotgun boomed in the confined space, devastating at close range. They emerged from the far side as the roof began to collapse, driving rescued horses before them. But they were exposed now, 50 yards from the house with Brennan's men closing in. Well. Brennan himself appeared from behind the chicken coop, revolver trained on them. The happy couple. Tell me, Sullivan, was she worth it? Worth your reputation, your home, that sweet virgin bride? Jake pushed Clara behind him. Margaret was never yours to avenge. Brennan, you're just using her memory to justify your own crimes. Maybe so. Brennan's scarred face twisted. But I'll sleep better knowing you're both in the ground. The shot that rang out didn't come from Brennan's gun. He staggered, looking down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his chest. Behind him, Tom Anderson lowered his rifle. "Sorry we're late," Anderson called. "Had to gather the boys first." Riders appeared from 3 directions. Neighbors Jake and Clara had helped over the years. Men who understood that frontier justice sometimes meant standing with your own against outside threats. Brennan's remaining men, outnumbered and with their leader down, threw down their weapons. Brennan lay in the reddening snow, life ebbing away. Jake knelt beside him. No satisfaction in watching a man die, even an enemy. She really kill herself?" Brennan asked, blood bubbling on his lips. "Margaret?" "Yes." "Waste," Brennan whispered. "All of it. Just waste." His eyes found Clara. "You won, fallen woman. You won." He died with those words, and Jake felt only emptiness where victory should have been. Too many lives destroyed by pride and the poison of respectability. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, taking statements and the surviving outlaws. He looked at the burned barn, the dead cattle, the graves they'd dug for Brennan and his man. "Seems clear enough." The marshal concluded. "Outlaws attacked. You defended yourselves with help from neighbors. Nothing more to say about it." But there was more. The weight of history. The price of choosing love over convention. The cost of being different in a world that demanded conformity. None of it would make the official report. As winter deepened, Jake and Clara rebuilt. The neighbors helped raise a new barn. Better than the first. The Anderson women, who had held themselves apart before, now visited Clara regularly, bringing recipes and gossip and the simple acceptance of shared survival. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing harness, Clara spoke what they'd both been thinking. "It's over now. Really over. Brennan's dead. The judge is dead. Margaret..." She trailed off. "We're free." "Are we?" Jake set down his tools. "Or are we just in a bigger cage, one with mountains for walls instead of town gossip?" Clara considered this. "Maybe all freedom is just choosing your own cage. But Jake, I choose this one, this life, this place, you, every day. I choose it." He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of leather and smoke that clung to her hair. "I never thanked you proper, for staying, for fighting, for being..." "For being what?" she asked against his chest. For being exactly who you are. Not trying to be the proper wife folks expect. Not apologizing for your past, just being Clara. She pulled back to look at him, green eyes bright with unshed tears. You know what the strangest part is? I think we might actually be happy. Despite everything, or maybe because of it, we built something good here. That spring brought unexpected news. A letter arrived from a law firm in Denver, Judge Whitfield's estate, tied up in legal battles, had finally been settled. Margaret's will, witnessed by her cousin Robert, left a surprising bequest. $5,000 to Jake Sullivan, in hopes he and Clara find the peace that eluded me. We can't take this, Clara said, staring at the bank draft. It's what she wanted. Jake replied, maybe accepting grace is harder than giving it, but we owe her that much. They used the money wisely, improving the ranch, buying good breeding stock, setting aside funds for the lean years that would surely come. But the best investment was in the community that had accepted them. They helped neighbors in need, contributed to the new school, became pillars of the valley in ways that would have shocked those who knew their origins. Years later, when their hair had gone gray and their faces showed the maps of hard living, a young couple appeared at their door. The woman was obviously with child, the man nervous and too young, both clearly running from something. We heard, the young man stammered. That is, folks in town said you might have work, might not ask too many questions. Jake and Clara exchanged looks, seeing their younger selves in these frightened children playing at being adults. Without words, agreement passed between them. Barn needs mucking, Jake said gruffly. Pays fair, and there's a cabin out back if you need it. The relief on both young faces was painful to see. As Clara showed them to the cabin, she heard the girl whisper to her husband, Are we safe? Safe as anywhere, Clara told her gently. This valley doesn't judge folks by where they've been, only by how they work and how they treat their neighbors. You'll do fine. That night, as Jake and Clara sat on their porch watching stars wheel overhead, he reached for her hand, still strong, still capable, wearing the simple gold band they'd exchanged at that bare-bones ceremony years ago. We've come a long way from Copper Creek, he said. Miles and years. Clara agreed. Do you think they still tell the story about the cowboy who spurned the virgin bride? Probably, but it's their story now, not ours. We wrote our own ending. Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of the life they'd built together. And what an ending it is. Jake Sullivan, what an ending it is. In the morning, they'd rise to work the ranch, to face whatever challenges the day brought. But for now, they sat together in the Montana darkness. Two people who had chosen the harder path and found it led to home. The dawn of their 20th year in Montana broke clear and cold, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Jake Sullivan, now 51, stood on the porch of the home they'd expanded over the years, watching the sun climb above peaks that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The small cabin had grown into a proper ranch house, with rooms added as prosperity allowed and need demanded. Clara emerged with 2 cups of coffee, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to accommodate old injuries. The years had silvered her dark hair and deepened the lines around her eyes. But to Jake, she'd never been more beautiful than in these moments of quiet morning companionship. Sarah's baby came in the night, she said, referring to the young couple they'd taken in years before. A healthy boy. They're calling him Jacob. Jake smiled, touched by the gesture. Sarah and her husband Will had become like the children they'd never had, turning their refuge into a proper home, raising 3 children in the cabin out back. The valley had accepted them as it had accepted Jake and Clara, gradually, then completely. 20 years, Clara mused, settling beside him. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were running from Copper Creek. Sometimes it feels like another lifetime. It was another lifetime. Jake took her hand, tracing the calluses that matched his own. We were different people then, broken in our own ways. And now we're just old ranchers watching the sunrise. They sat in comfortable silence, but both knew this peace was precious, perhaps finite. Jake's heart had been giving him trouble. A fluttering that came with exertion. A breathlessness that hadn't been there before. The doctor in town had been frank about his limitations, as if reading his thoughts. Clara squeezed his hand. "However long we have, it's been enough." More than enough. The morning brought visitors. Tom Anderson and his wife, bearing news from town and a fresh-baked pie. They'd long since stopped being just neighbors, becoming the family Jake and Clara had chosen for themselves. "There's talk of the railroad coming through the valley," Tom said, accepting coffee, "bringing change whether we want it or not." "Change isn't always bad," Clara observed. "We're proof of that." "Mrs. Anderson laughed. "True enough, though I still remember being scandalized when you first arrived, a woman in trousers, living with a man who wasn't her husband, at least not then. My mother would have fainted. Good thing your mother didn't live to see you defending us with a rifle when Brennan came calling," Clara replied with a grin. They spoke of simple things. Cattle prices, the new school teacher, whose son was courting whose daughter. The conversation was punctuated by the sounds of the working ranch. Horses nickering, cowboys calling to each other, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop. After the Andersons left, Jake found himself restless. He saddled his old mare, needing to ride the land one more time. Clara watched from the porch, understanding without words what drove him. The ranch sprawled before him, 5,000 acres of good grass, clear water, sturdy fences. They'd built it from nothing. Through blizzards and droughts, through isolation and acceptance, every fence post, every building, every carefully managed pasture represented a choice to stay, to fight, to build rather than destroy. He rode to the small cemetery they'd established on a hill overlooking the valley. 3 graves marked their losses. The young hand killed in a stampede. The baby Sarah and Will had lost to fever. And, surprisingly, a stone for Margaret Whitfield. Clara had insisted on it, saying someone should remember the girl with kindness. The marker read simply, "Margaret Whitfield, 1868 to 1890. She sought freedom." Standing there, hat in hand, Jake spoke to the stones and the wind. "We made a good life. Margaret, not the one you or I expected, but good nonetheless. I hope you found your peace." When he returned home, he found Clara in the kitchen with Sarah, teaching her to make bread, a simple domestic scene that filled him with profound gratitude. This was what they'd built. Not just a ranch, but a refuge. Not just a marriage, but a partnership. Not just a life, but a legacy. That evening, the entire extended household gathered for supper. Jake and Clara, Sarah and Will and their children. The 2 ranch hands who'd become part of their chosen family. The table groaned under the weight of simple abundance. Beef from their own herd. Vegetables from Clara's garden, bread still warm from the oven. Will raised his glass. "To Jake and Clara Sullivan, 20 years ago, you gave us sanctuary when the world cast us out. You showed us that love matters more than reputation, that work matters more than words, that chosen family can be stronger than blood. To the best people we know. To the cowboy who spurned the virgin bride," Sarah added with a gentle smile, "and found true love with a woman brave enough to be herself." Clara's eyes glistened. "To all of us outcasts who found home." They drank, and Jake felt the flutter in his chest again. Stronger this time. But he pushed the sensation aside, focusing instead on the faces around the table, illuminated by lamplight and love. Later, as they prepared for bed in the room they'd shared for 2 decades, Clara helped him with his boots. A small intimacy that spoke of years of caring for each other. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what happens when, after—" "Clara, no, let me say this." She sat beside him on the bed, taking his face in her hands. "When my time comes, bury me next to you on that hill. Let the gossips wonder about the fallen woman lying beside the cowboy for eternity. We've earned that much scandal, at least." Jake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her, lavender soap and mountain air, strength and sweetness combined. "Wherever I go, whatever comes next, I'll wait for you. That's a promise?" Clara Sullivan, I know you will. She kissed him softly. You've never broken a promise to me yet. They lay down together. Two people who'd traveled hard roads to find each other, who'd built something lasting from society's scattered pieces. Outside, the Montana wind sang through the pines, carrying the scent of coming snow, the promise of another winter, another spring, another season in their hard-won paradise. In the morning, they'd face whatever came, Jake's failing heart, the railroad's approach, the changing world that had no place for their kind of story anymore. But tonight, they had this, the warmth of shared blankets, the comfort of familiar breathing, the knowledge that they'd chosen each other every day for 20 years and would choose each other still, until choice was no longer theirs to make. Tell me again, Clara whispered in the darkness. Tell me how it ends. Jake smiled, pulling her closer. The cowboy spurned the virgin bride and shared his bed with the fallen woman, and they lived, not happily ever after, because that's for fairy tales, but truly, they lived truly, and they loved deeply, and they left the world a little kinder than they found it. That's a good ending, Clara murmured, already drifting toward sleep. The best, Jake agreed, closing his eyes and feeling his unsteady heart find its rhythm in time with hers. Morning would come, as it always did. But for now, in this moment between darkness and dawn, they were complete. Two souls who'd found their way home to each other across all the miles and years, through all the storms and scandals, beyond all the judgments of a world that never understood that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that break all the rules. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the answer came swift and sure across the valley. Even the wild things knew, in this harsh land, you survived by choosing your partner well and holding on through every season. Jake and Clara Sullivan had chosen well, and they'd held on, and that, in the end, was everything. Thank you for listening to this story of Jake and Clara, two outcasts who found love in the unforgiving landscape of the Old West. Where are you listening to this tale? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know where in the world their story has reached. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories of love, redemption, and the untamed frontier. What did you think of Jake and Clara's journey? Share your thoughts. Every comment helps keep these stories alive.